How do we even begin to understand such evil? That question has echoed throughout history, often in response to incomprehensible acts of cruelty or injustice. But today, more than 150 years ago in California, the state Supreme Court ruled that it was legal to murder a person of color as long as the person doing the murdering was white. In this episode, we're going to examine how the California Supreme Court made that decision, what led up to it, and why its effects are still being felt today. Between 1848, when gold was discovered at Sutter's Mill, and 1869, when the Transcontinental Railroad was completed, tens of thousands of Chinese immigrants arrived in California. They came for the gold, but mostly they were brought in to work the mines after their hopes of striking it rich on their own had mostly been dashed. These miners endured horrific conditions, working for long hours without pay in dangerous, dark, dank tunnels where the air was thick with the smell of stale waste and gunpowder. When rock slides or explosions injured them, their wounds would become infected and fester because they couldn't take time off to recover. And when they died, their bodies were tossed into unmarked mass graves. But the Chinese weren't just enduring these conditions, they were organizing. They formed benevolent associations to help new arrivals navigate American society and advocate for their rights. They began to publish newspapers in English and in their native tongue, which helped to spread news about the horrific conditions they faced in the mines. And although the Chinese were not allowed to testify in court, if accused of crimes, they were still able to hire lawyers to defend them. Now, all of this did not set well with the white population in California. The Chinese were seen as a threat, both politically and economically. After a series of violent robberies along the routes between mining camps and railheads, white miners became convinced that Chinese immigrants were stealing their hard-earned wages. Although there was no evidence to support this claim, white Californians became convinced that Chinese people could not be trusted and that their presence was threatening the very fabric of their society. By the mid-1850s, anti-Chinese sentiment in California was so intense that two separate constitutional conventions were held to discuss the possibility of barring Chinese immigration altogether. Although in the end, no such laws were passed, a pall of suspicion and mistrust hung over every Chinese person living in California. Then in 1854, a young Chinese miner named Ling Sing was shot in the back and killed while walking home from work. He had testified in court earlier that year in a case involving stolen mining tools, and some believe he may have implicated a white miner named George Hall in the theft. Whether he actually did or not is not important. What is important is that the white community feared that he might have implicated them in his testimony. So one night, a group of white men entered Ling Sing's home, beat him severely, and then shot him in the back as he walked home. A jury of 6 white men heard the case and found George Hall not guilty of murder, but guilty of manslaughter. He was sentenced to 6 months in jail. Hall appealed, and the case eventually wound up before the California Supreme Court. The justices heard arguments from both sides. On behalf of Hall, attorney Delphine H.C. LeConte argued that Section 394 of California's Civil Practice Act applied to the Chinese as well as blacks, mulattoes, and Indians, and therefore, the lower court erred in allowing Chinese witnesses to testify against his client. The section in question read, in civil cases, neither the deposition nor the testimony of a black, mulatto, or Indian person shall be received against a white person, or of a white person against a black, mulatto, or Indian person, unless the party offering the same shall first establish a character for truth, honesty, and integrity. At the time, this section was part of the state's evidentiary code and governed which witnesses could be called to testify in court. It was originally enacted in 1850, in large part due to the lobbying efforts of Southern California's white population, who feared the growing number of black and Native American witnesses that were testifying in trials involving land disputes with indigenous tribes. Then in 1852, the legislature amended the law to include Asians as well, although no specific mention was made of the Chinese. Instead, the amendment referred to persons of the African race, which at the time included anyone with any amount of African ancestry, regardless of how far back it went. It also included anyone who had an appearance of African nativity or African descent. In arguing for the application of this statute to the Chinese, Lacondi pointed to the fact that they were racially distinct from white people, and that their immigration to California was relatively recent. Because of this, he said Chinese people were inherently more prone to dishonesty and untrustworthy, and therefore, under Section 394, their testimony could not be admitted against a white defendant. On June 22, 1854, the court issued its ruling. Writing for the majority, Chief Justice R.C. Hill reported that the legislature intended to include the Chinese within the meaning of the act. Now, several members of the court believed that the Chinese should not have been included in the statute. As Justice Henry W. Haight wrote in his dissent, "I think the statute ought not to apply to the Chinese. They are not a race with us. They are strangers to our government, unacquainted with our laws and customs, and speaking a different language from ours." Yet the majority opinion prevailed and the People v. Hall decision was born. After the ruling was handed down, the justices went on to rule that the Chinese could not testify against anyone who was not also of Chinese descent. This meant that the Chinese could not testify in most criminal cases in California, since most crimes were tried in courts with white juries. In effect, the Chinese had no standing in white courts and were completely without legal recourse. In addition, the court's ruling prompted the California legislature to pass a law barring Chinese people from owning or leasing real estate in the state. It also resulted in the creation of exclusionary laws that prevented Chinese immigrants from entering California unless they could prove they were coming as a laborer or merchant. But those laws will have to wait for another video. In many ways, the People v. Hall decision is the spiritual predecessor to the Supreme Court's Dred Scott ruling, which denied citizenship to anyone of African descent and declared that Congress had no authority to prohibit slavery in U.S. territories. Like Dred Scott, People v. Hall was based on a racist worldview that equated blackness and Chineseness with untrustworthiness and inherent inferiority. Both decisions also demonstrate the insidious way in which racism can creep into the highest levels of government. The authors of the 14th Amendment, for example, wrestled with how best to address the issue of race in the United States. Some members of the amendment's drafting committee wanted to include language guaranteeing equal protection of the laws to all persons born in the United States, regardless of race. But others, including Senator John A. Logan, argued that such a provision would be too radical and would threaten the balance of power between the states and the federal government. Ultimately, the phrase "all persons born in the United States" was replaced with "all persons subject to the jurisdiction thereof," leaving open the door for states like California to institute Jim Crow laws. And although the Chinese were not specifically mentioned in the 14th Amendment, the justices in People v. Hall found a way to use the amendment to bolster their argument that Chinese witnesses could not be trusted. In his dissenting opinion, Justice Haight argued that the majority opinion was inconsistent with the guarantees of the 14th Amendment. He wrote, "The equal protection of the laws which is guaranteed to all persons born in the United States is not the mere privilege to go into the courts and there to be told that you shall not be here." Yet Haight's dissent fell on deaf ears. For the next 8 decades, People v. Hall stood as a bulwark of white supremacy in California and a shining example of how racism could be codified and justified in the highest court of a U.S. state. It was until 1935 that the California Supreme Court finally overturned its previous ruling in the case of Berry v. Superior Court. In the Berry case, a Chinese woman named Mei Ling was sexually assaulted by 2 white men. She identified her attackers in a police lineup, but when she appeared in court to testify, the judge barred her from taking the stand. The defense attorney objected to her testimony on the basis of People v. Hall, but the California Supreme Court saw things differently this time around. Writing for the majority, Justice Wilbur M. Clark stated that the fundamental rights and liberties which are enjoyed by the people of this state cannot be denied to anyone who is subject to the jurisdiction thereof simply because of his birth in a foreign country or the ancestry from which he may have sprung. So that's what happened. For over 80 years, white Americans could get away with murdering people of color just as long as they were white themselves. And the reason that happened is because they used their political power to write laws that enforced racist beliefs. This isn't just a historical curiosity. We see similar tactics being used today by conservative politicians across the country. This episode is part of a series exploring the hidden roots of modern American politics. If you want to watch more episodes, please follow the link below. Thanks for watching. In 1923, a group of Chinese men stood outside in the cold, waiting for the streetcar that would take them to the courthouse. They had come to testify in a murder trial, but when their turn came, they were told to go home. The judge said they were not allowed to testify because of their race. What was the reasoning behind this decision? Well, it was openly racist. The judge claimed that the Chinese were a race of people whom nature has marked as inferior, and who are incapable of progress or intellectual development beyond a certain point. He said that if Chinese immigrants were allowed to testify, then whites might lose control of government and society itself. The Chinese men were upset, but they didn't really have any options. At the time, the U.S. government enforced a series of laws known as the Chinese Exclusion Acts, which barred Chinese immigration and revoked the citizenship of Chinese people born in the U.S. In addition, many states passed laws explicitly barring Chinese people from testifying in court. So they couldn't even try to get justice in the courts. These laws were intended to keep the Chinese out of American life altogether, but they didn't always work. And so when the Chinese did interact with white Americans, it was often contentious. And when things went wrong, the Chinese were in no position to defend themselves. Because the court's decision was based on an assumption of inherent inferiority, these laws essentially gave whites a license to discriminate against and even commit violence against the Chinese. This became especially problematic during the 1920s, when many Chinese immigrants worked in mining and railroad jobs in the American West, working alongside Mexican immigrants. But whereas Mexican immigrants were able to return home if they faced discrimination or violence, Chinese workers bore the brunt of racial violence without any recourse. In the end, these laws and attitudes persisted until the 1960s, leaving a legacy of racism that persists to this day. But how did we ever arrive at such a system? To find out, let's do some history. After the Civil War, the U.S. entered a period of rapid industrialization, which drew millions of immigrants to its cities and factories. In the early 20th century, more than half of the nation's immigrants were Chinese, fleeing poverty, famine, and political turmoil. They found jobs in fields like mining, railroad construction, and domestic service. But their presence caused resentment among white workers who saw the Chinese as a threat. Not only did the Chinese work long hours for low wages, they were willing to work for even lower wages. Many white Americans believed that the Chinese were stealing jobs away from whites and lowering wages across the board. By the 1870s, anti-Chinese sentiment was running high and local governments began passing ordinances restricting where Chinese immigrants could live and work. For example, in 1862, San Francisco prohibited the employment of Chinese in domestic service. And in 1870, state laws barred them from owning property. These ordinances culminated in the first Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, which barred further immigration of Chinese laborers and mandated their deportation. Although it was supposed to last for 10 years, Congress renewed it indefinitely in 1892. These laws created a sense of hopelessness for the Chinese immigrants, trapping them in a cycle of low-paying, dangerous jobs with no real opportunity for advancement. However, despite these obstacles, the Chinese still fought back against the discriminatory laws and gained some legal victories. In 1889, the Supreme Court ruled that denying Chinese students admission to public schools was unconstitutional in the Yiquo v. Hopkins case. Additionally, in 1893, the Supreme Court struck down a California law that barred Chinese from working in hazardous occupations. And in 1914, the Supreme Court overturned a similar Oregon law. But despite these minor setbacks, anti-Chinese sentiment continued to grow and culminated in one of the most infamous acts of racial violence in U.S. history. On October 24, 1871, a fire broke out in San Francisco's Chinatown. Quickly spreading through the wooden buildings, the fire spread to neighboring areas, destroying nearly 75% of the city. Although there was little evidence that the Chinese were responsible for the fire, white San Franciscans blamed them anyway, leading to a mass exodus of Chinese residents. White mobs attacked and murdered many of those who stayed behind, leaving 17 dead and 150 injured. In response, the Committee of 100, an organization formed after the fire to raise money for the victims, funneled very little money to the Chinese survivors. Instead, the committee spent far more money on deporting the Chinese back to China. The San Francisco Board of Supervisors approved the creation of an exclusionary zone to bar the Chinese from entering white neighborhoods and businesses. After this incident, the Chinese were largely confined to living in small enclaves and were denied access to education, housing, and economic opportunities. As a result, the Chinese population in San Francisco plummeted from about 20,000 before the fire to just over 4,000 by 1880. By the 1920s, anti-Asian rhetoric became increasingly popular as more Asians immigrated to the United States, primarily from China and the Philippines. The new wave of immigrants were different from the earlier Chinese immigrants. Many were U.S. citizens or had been born in the U.S. and spoke English fluently. But to many white Americans, this didn't matter. Regardless of their citizenship status or fluency in English, the newcomers were seen as a threat to white society and the economy. In 1922, the Los Angeles Times ran a series of articles warning of a coming Oriental menace that threatened to overrun the West Coast. The articles claimed that the Chinese were trying to take over key industries and infiltrate white institutions. While there is no evidence that the Chinese were taking over anything, this fear-mongering set the stage for increased violence against them. In 1923, tensions between white Americans and Chinese immigrants reached a boiling point in downtown Los Angeles. On the night of October 24th, a white woman alleged that she had been assaulted by several Chinese men. Although the police never found any evidence that the attack actually happened, rumors of the attack spread quickly. That evening, a mob of 500 white Angelenos attacked the SS-14, a ship carrying Chinese immigrants docked at the LA harbor. They beat passengers, pulled women off the ship, and assaulted them. When the police finally intervened, they arrested 11 of the attackers, but all 11 were soon released. In response, Chinese Americans organized and protested the lack of justice. But their protests were met with violence. During the ensuing riots, whites attacked Chinese businesses and homes, forcing thousands to flee. The violence culminated in a confrontation on October 28, when police attempted to disperse a crowd of protesters. When someone fired a shot, the police opened fire on the crowd, killing 5 and wounding 6. Following the riots, -1 of the Chinese immigrants who had been arrested during the initial attack were convicted of assault and battery and sentenced to prison. The Chinese community responded with outrage, refusing to cooperate with the police or courts and beginning to flee Los Angeles for other cities. After this event, anti-Chinese violence subsided somewhat, but the underlying racism persisted. The Chinese were viewed with suspicion and fear and were routinely denied jobs and housing. In fact, in 1924, a federal judge ruled that Chinese immigrants could not testify in court, citing the infamous quote, "The Chinese are a race of people whom nature has marked as inferior and who are incapable of progress or intellectual development beyond a certain point." Despite this injustice, the Chinese community continued to fight for equality and justice. They organized schools and businesses and advocated for civil rights. But it wasn't until the 1960s that their efforts began to pay off. In 1965, the Immigration and Nationality Act abolished the national origins quota system that had barred Chinese immigration since the 1920s, opening the door for a new wave of Chinese immigrants. However, while these changes were a step in the right direction, the legacy of the Chinese Exclusion Acts continues to affect Chinese Americans today. Despite the progress that has been made, anti-Asian racism and violence continue to persist, demonstrating that the fight for equality and justice is far from over. Hey, you made it to the end of another crazy history video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. I discussed how the Civil War created a massive labor shortage in the American West that led to the first wave of Chinese immigration. As I mentioned, though, this influx of workers would eventually lead to increased tensions between the Chinese and white Americans. And the question is, what did those tensions look like? Well, one way they manifested themselves was through violence against the Chinese. But another way was through the courts. You see, as the number of Chinese immigrants grew, so too did the amount of anti-Chinese sentiment. And one of its more insidious manifestations was the creation of laws specifically designed to exclude the Chinese from American society and to strip them of their basic rights as people. To understand how such laws came about, it helps to focus in on just one state, California. But keep in mind that what happened there was also happening in mining camps across Nevada, Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, Utah, and Colorado. The first major blow came in 1862 when California passed the Foreign Miners Act. Now, this law didn't explicitly target the Chinese, but instead targeted all non-white people by imposing a special head tax, or a poll tax, on them. The tax required miners to pay $2.50 per month for a license to mine. While this may not sound like much today, given that the average monthly wage for miners was about $30, the tax constituted an effective wealth tax on miners, especially since many of them were poor immigrants trying to get ahead. But most significantly, this law made clear that California was becoming increasingly hostile to the Chinese. It wasn't until 1866 that the first major anti-Chinese statute was passed. This was the aptly named Act to prohibit the employment of Chinese. This law banned Chinese labor on public works projects. In San Francisco alone, hundreds of Chinese were immediately thrown out of work, even though many of them had been employed on public projects for years. But with unemployment rates falling in the wake of the Civil War, many white workers now demanded that the city hire only whites. And this demand was backed up with threats of violence. For instance, after the employment of a Chinese man on a public project, one angry mob gathered outside City Hall, broke down the doors, and forced the Board of Supervisors to meet their demands. But as time went on, the Chinese began to fight back. After all, these laws were clearly discriminating against them simply because of their race. So in 1876, the Chinese in San Francisco filed a lawsuit, one that aimed to strike down that same Foreign Miners Act that had been passed 14 years prior. At the heart of this case was the question of whether or not the Constitution applied to the Chinese. After all, the 14th Amendment guaranteed equal protection under the law to everyone born in the United States except for Native Americans and people who were formerly enslaved. And because most of the Chinese in America were not born in the United States, they argued that they were not protected by this amendment. This argument seemed to find support in the ruling of one circuit court, but the case was eventually brought before the U.S. Supreme Court. There, however, the decision was more complicated because while the justices agreed that the 14th Amendment did not apply to the Chinese, they said it was only because the Chinese were not yet considered to be a part of the American community, which meant that the government could not afford them citizenship. But here's the thing, the very laws that California passed kept the Chinese out of American society. They were denied housing, subjected to horrific working conditions, and regularly assaulted by violent mobs. So how could they become part of American society if the state barred them from doing so? Well, this reality was best captured in a dissenting opinion written by Justice William Strong. He argued that the majority opinion did nothing less than to legalize and institutionalize racism. But ultimately, his argument fell on deaf ears. The majority opinion stood and the Foreign Miners Act remained in place. Now, it's important to understand that the Chinese were not the only victims of this kind of legislation. Other Asian immigrants, as well as African Americans and Native Americans, were subject to similar laws and prejudices. But in this video, I'm focusing on the Chinese because I think their story is lesser known. And besides, the anti-Chinese laws were often the most severe and far-reaching. For example, in addition to being barred from public projects, the Chinese were also barred from testifying in court against white Americans. And if a white person accused a Chinese person of a crime, the Chinese person could not call any witnesses to testify on their behalf. And that goes double if the accusation was of a sexual nature. In fact, Chinese women were routinely accused of prostitution, largely as a result of racist stereotypes that painted Chinese immigrants as immoral and uncivilized. And because of laws like these, Chinese women were effectively unable to defend themselves against such charges. By the 1870s, then, life for the Chinese in California was unbearable. So, it's no surprise that they began leaving the state in droves. In fact, by 1879, the Chinese population in California had fallen by over 50%. But rather than use this as an opportunity to reverse their discriminatory policies, the white Americans in California doubled down. In 1879, voters approved the infamous 13th Amendment to the California Constitution. And let me tell you, its implications were devastating. It stated in part, "Neither the whole nor any part of any city or town in this state shall be set apart for the habitation of persons of Chinese descent." In other words, this amendment legalized the creation of ethnic cleansing zones where Chinese people could be forcibly removed and prohibited from ever returning. In addition, the amendment gave local governments permission to buy out Chinese residents at whatever price they could agree upon. And if the Chinese refused to sell their homes or businesses, then the local government could bring them to court and force them to do so. Imagine how outraged you would be if your government told you that you could be kicked out of your home whenever it wanted to and for whatever price it decided was fair. That's exactly what this amendment did to the Chinese. This same year, an even more draconian amendment was proposed, one that aimed to ban Chinese immigration altogether. But it failed to pass. Still, such a proposal was an ominous sign of things to come. Throughout the rest of the 1870s and into the 1880s, anti-Chinese violence peaked. Entire towns of Chinese immigrants were attacked, raped, robbed, and driven out of the state. The worst incident of this violence occurred in 1885 when a mob of 2,000 white Americans attacked the town of Rock Springs, Wyoming. There they killed at least 28 Chinese immigrants, injured many others, and destroyed over $1 million in property. In the wake of such violence, it's not surprising that Chinese immigration slowed dramatically. In fact, between 1880 and 1890, the Chinese population in the U.S. actually declined by 25%. But once again, white Americans used this as an excuse to escalate their campaign against the Chinese. In 1882, Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act. It barred Chinese laborers from entering the United States and explicitly forbade them from becoming naturalized citizens. And in 1892, Congress passed the Geary Act, which required all Chinese immigrants to carry a certificate of residence around their neck at all times. And if they could not produce the certificate when asked, then they would be arrested and sent back to China. So as you can see, the situation for the Chinese worsened drastically over the course of a few decades. But it's also important to realize that this was by no means unique to California. Similar anti-Chinese laws existed throughout the American West. And the reality for the Chinese was much the same. In Nevada, for instance, the Chinese had been barred from owning property since 1859. In 1864, Idaho passed a law prohibiting the employment of Chinese on public works projects. And in 1887, Oregon passed a law that barred Chinese immigrants from owning land. But eventually the tide began to turn. In 1915, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the Geary Act was unconstitutional. But it took another 26 years before Congress finally repealed the Chinese Exclusion Act. And it wasn't until 1943 that the U.S. Supreme Court struck down California's 13th Amendment. Still, these were only symbolic victories because the realities of racism and discrimination continued long after these laws were overturned. In fact, the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II showed that little had changed. To learn more about that injustice, stay tuned for future episodes. Meanwhile, if you want to learn more about the experiences of the Chinese during this time period, I'd recommend reading The Chinese in America by Iris Chang. It's an excellent overview of the history of the Chinese in the United States. Well, here we are at episode number 27, which means it is time to talk about one of the most infamous and notorious laws in American history, the Chinese Exclusion Act. Before I get into it, however, there's a little housekeeping item that I want to attend to first. In our last episode, I made some pretty serious claims about the outcome of the Dred Scott decision and its effects on the law of the land. Now, while I stand by my argument that the ruling was a disaster and had terrible consequences, I neglected to mention one crucial detail. That detail is that the ruling only applied to territories and did not apply to states. In other words, Dred Scott didn't make slavery legal in the states. It only made it legal in territories. But because most Western lands acquired after the Louisiana Purchase were organized into territories rather than states, this distinction was kind of beside the point. And also, many people read the decision as broadly overturning the Missouri Compromise, which it sort of did. So my bad for overlooking that important detail. Also, I just want to thank everybody who has been sharing these videos with your friends, colleagues, and loved ones. One of my goals in making this series was to reach as many people as possible and get them interested in learning more about Asian American history. So your help in spreading the word is greatly appreciated. And now let's get back to the Chinese Exclusion Act. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 is a well-known piece of legislation that barred Chinese laborers from entering the United States and denied citizenship to those already living here. The law's stated purpose was to protect American workers, but its real intent was to keep the United States as white as possible. Now, while it would be an exaggeration to say that anti-Chinese sentiment was ubiquitous or even widespread before the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act, public opinion was nevertheless turning against the Chinese due to a variety of factors, including economic anxieties, racial prejudice, and political opportunism. During the mid-19th century, thousands of Chinese men immigrated to the United States to work on the Transcontinental Railroad. By the time the railroad was completed in 1869, however, most of these men were out of work. Rather than return to China, they simply relocated to other industries and to other parts of the country where they worked as miners, servants, domestic workers, and in restaurants. Despite their economic success in these fields, Chinese immigrants continued to face discrimination. They were often paid less than white workers, were subjected to verbal and physical abuse, and were denied access to public services like housing and transportation. As tensions grew, several anti-Chinese riots broke out in the western states. The worst of these occurred in 1877 when an economic downturn in the mining industry coincided with the arrival of the first Chinese women as mail-order brides. The resulting backlash led to violent attacks against the Chinese, culminating in the destruction of the city of Rock Springs, Wyoming. In all, 8 Chinese were killed and 25 injured while another 250 lost their homes and businesses. In response to this violence, the Chinese began to organize and advocate for their own interests. In 1878, they founded the Chinese Protective Association, which raised money for victims of violence, lobbied local and national officials, and ran a newspaper called the Chinese Daily. Despite these efforts, however, the federal government took little, if any, action to protect Chinese immigrants. And in 1882, Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, which barred Chinese laborers from entering the United States and denied citizenship to those already living here. The Chinese Exclusion Act was renewed every 10 years thereafter until 1943. Now, the Chinese Exclusion Act was certainly an egregious violation of civil rights and an immoral stain on American history. But as awful as the law was, it is important to recognize that it was not the first time that the United States government infringed on the rights of Asian Americans. In fact, the Chinese Exclusion Act builds directly on the earlier denial of rights to Native Americans and the more recent denial of rights to African Americans. To fully understand the Chinese Exclusion Act, then, I think it will be helpful to look at an earlier case involving the Chinese in the U.S., the territory of New Mexico v. Heshan. The facts surrounding the case are actually quite straightforward. In 1868, a Chinese man named A.Y. Yishan married a Native American woman named Gertrudis Ledoux. Together they had 2 children and lived in a small house near the village of San Pedro, New Mexico. On April 24, 1873, however, a fire destroyed their home. Soon afterwards, Yishan went to the local courthouse to obtain a building permit so that he could rebuild. He was denied. Now, why was he denied? Well, this part of the story requires us to take a little detour into the laws governing territories. See, when the United States acquired New Mexico in 1848 following the Mexican-American War, Congress passed the New Mexico Organic Act, which outlined the basic laws and structure for the territorial government. Among these laws was one specifically addressing who could testify in court. And that law explicitly excluded all people of Chinese, African, and Native American descent. To make matters worse, the comparable law in California, the McArdle Bill, did not go into effect until 1873, the same year as the events surrounding the Yishan case. So Yishan had actually been living in a place where the law did not bar him from testifying. Nevertheless, when Yishan went to court to try to get his building permit approved, the judge ruled against him based on the comparable law in California, which at that moment was technically still in effect. Fortunately for Yishan, though, the case eventually made its way to the New Mexico Supreme Court, which ruled in his favor. In reaching their decision, the court acknowledged that excluding non-white people from testifying was discriminatory. But they argued that such exclusion was justified in this case because the testimony of such persons would be inherently untrustworthy. However, the court also recognized the absurdity of denying one man the right to testify while allowing another to do so based on nothing more than accident of birth. As such, the court concluded that since the Enabling Act did not include language barring Chinese people from testifying, the people of New Mexico had no legal basis to deny Yishan the right to rebuild his house. While the court's logic was sound, however, their reasoning was far from airtight. The court could have easily upheld the lower court's decision based on technicalities alone. For example, the lower court had mistakenly cited a California law when the case was governed by New Mexico law. Also, the lower court never actually held a trial and heard evidence as to whether Chinese people were generally trustworthy witnesses. Nevertheless, the New Mexico Supreme Court chose not to focus on these procedural defects, but instead grappled with the merits of the case. As a result, the court produced an opinion that hinted at a more expansive understanding of civil rights, suggesting that if enough cases came before them, they might strike down the discriminatory law altogether. As it turned out, though, the court would never get that chance. Following the Supreme Court's ruling, Yishan was able to obtain his building permit and rebuild his house. But the controversy surrounding the case caused enough of an uproar that Congress intervened. In 1874, Congress passed the New Mexico Amendment, which explicitly barred all people of Chinese, African, and Native American descent from testifying in court. Once again, the Supreme Court could have struck down this amendment as well, but instead they upheld it in a 5-1 decision. The rationale behind the ruling was that the amendment did not violate the Equal Protection Clause because it applied equally to all people of Chinese, African, and Native American descent. And therein lies the rub. As Justice Ward Hunt wrote in his majority opinion, quote, "The classification here made is not based on the idea of the inferiority or superior of any race or the subordination or equality of one rank to another, but is made solely in the interest of the good order and the public welfare of the territory." Unfortunately, this rationale would become a common refrain in future cases upholding discriminatory laws against Asian Americans, as well as other minority groups. However, the more things changed, the more they stayed the same. While the Chinese Exclusion Act was indeed an egregious violation of civil rights, it built directly on the earlier denial of rights to Native Americans and African Americans. And in both cases, the Supreme Court played a key role in legitimizing these violations. If you enjoyed this episode, I highly recommend checking out a book called The Making of Asian America, A History by Erica Lee. The book was published in 2019 and is a Wonderful overview of Asian American history from before the arrival of Europeans all the way up to the present day. This is a super interesting topic, and Professor Lee is an excellent writer. You can find the book through the usual online retailers or through the link in the description below. Alright, everyone, that's it for this episode. As always, I'm interested in hearing your thoughts. Did you know about the Yishun case prior to this episode? And what do you think of the Supreme Court's ruling? Let me know in the comments section below. While you're down there, don't forget to like and subscribe. And if you want to support the channel directly, you can do so at a website. I'll see you all next time.